12-year-old girl is murdered in her own home. And the case stalls when investigators find little forensic evidence at the crime scene. But scientists also know that criminals unknowingly take evidence with them as they leave a crime scene. And in this case, the killer left with the genetic fingerprint of his victim. In between two of Minnesota's 10,000 lakes is the small town of Waseca, a quiet community with virtually no violent crime. Not far from the shores of Loon Lake was the home of Connie Larson and her 3 daughters.
They're all like 5 and 4 years apart, but they are very close. They were never apart, and they just adored each other. Callie was definitely the baby of the family, and she was Daddy's little girl.
12-year-old Callie Jo was in the 7th grade and loved gymnastics.
She was good, I think, because she just loved it and she put a lot of energy into it. It was a wonderful place for her to be, and with her energy and spirit, she just really did well in gymnastics.
After school on April 20th, 1999, Callie Jo got off her school bus and walked down this path towards home, just as she always did. Callie Jo was the first one home that day. Her mother and sister were expected later.
The rule in the family was everyone needed to be home and no visitors at 5 o'clock, because that's when I arrived home, and then we had our family time.
16-year-old Jamie was the next family member to arrive home. When she opened the door, she saw evidence of a burglary and something far worse. Jamie immediately called her mother at work and then police.
I realized that there was something wrong and she wasn't telling me.
Coming around the corner and looking up the stairs was a difficult sight for everybody. I mean, there were 30-year investigators that were having a difficult time with that. But it's just looking at who would do something like this.
Upstairs, Callie Jo was dead.
The fatal stab wound was in the left chest area, cut the ascending aorta, and she bled to death internally.
It's still hard for me to think that she's gone. I mean, that means dead. It just can't be.
I've got 2 kids of my own. If this occurred to one of my children, I don't know what I would do, and I can't even imagine it.
Callie Jo's school books were near the front door, an indication she may have surprised the intruder. The point of entry was the basement door. Some cash, silver certificates, and the girl's CD collection of music were missing. Forensic scientists found blood on the stairs, which was collected for analysis. Despite the clutter, investigators also looked for fingerprints.
You kind of tend to focus on the areas where you're pretty sure that the perpetrator was. And then you focus on areas where drawers were tossed and stuff has been, taken out and moved around. There weren't too many surfaces left in that house that did not have some kind of fingerprint powder residue.
Investigators vacuumed the carpeted floors for possible trace evidence. They were convinced that the killer had left behind enough forensic evidence to catch him.
We had a lot of fingerprints. There were hundreds of hairs in those vacuumings. I initially thought that we were in good shape.
A forensic case is like a puzzle, and you are trying to find different pieces of the puzzle that fit to give you the picture as to what happened in the case.
Callie Jo Larson's death set a sad precedent for Waseca, Minnesota. The small town had never had a homicide in its history.
It destroys the safety factor of everybody in this town. Everybody.
Well, I think a lot more people started locking their doors, which sounds a little flippant, but that's the reaction.
Forensic scientists thought the blood on the steps near Callie Jo's body may have been the killer's, but forensic tests revealed it was Callie Jo's. Next, investigators hoped the killer left his fingerprints in the home, but this was another dead end.
When all the dust had settled, so to speak, all of the latent prints that we had taken out of the house were identified to family members and friends. There were no unknowns left.
One of the fingerprints found on the bathroom sink was initially difficult to identify, but later it was identified as Callie Jo Larson's fingerprint. Over time, Peterson would come to easily recognize Callie Jo's unique pattern.
She had a loop pattern, but it had another loop that was over the first loop and kind of came to a point on the other end. That's unique. You don't see that very often.
The only other physical evidence from the crime scene were two foreign hairs, one found on Callie Jo's body, the other on the carpet.
But until you know whose hairs to compare them to, you've got nothing.
And the hairs didn't have any root material, so they couldn't be sent for nuclear DNA testing. A neighbor reported seeing an unfamiliar man near the Larson home around the time of the murder. This is the composite sketch of the man. Another neighbor saw a black pickup truck in the area. Police searched their records for individuals matching this general description who also had a past history of burglary and sex offenses. They found 12 potential suspects.
Well, we called them the Dirty Dozen. And because we had 12 suspects that we could not exclude from the investigation, either, by alibi or whatever reason.
One of the so-called Dirty Dozen was a convicted sex offender, Donald Blum. The significant fact about Blum was that he was also a suspect in the kidnapping and murder of 19-year-old Katie Poyer, a convenience store cashier in Moose Lake, Minnesota, just a few hours' drive away. These are security camera pictures of that abduction. Unfortunately, they weren't clear enough to identify the abductor. Police learned that Blum made several trips to Waseca around the time of Callie Jo's murder. He also drove a black pickup truck like the one seen near Larson's home.
And I was being bombarded with so many truths that I didn't want to know. So as I heard more about Donald Blum, I suppose the more fascinated we became with the possibility that it could be.
Blum denied any involvement in Callie Jo's death and said he had an alibi for the day of the murder. As winter approached in Waseca, hope faded.
November, December was a very bleak time. Everybody was very depressed.
Despite more than 30,000 pages of reports and boxes of physical evidence, investigators weren't any closer to solving the crime than the day it occurred.
And at that point, we had absolutely nothing. And I was really becoming concerned whether this case was ever going to be solved.
And soon, police in Waseca were faced with another crime problem. There were a rash of home burglaries in Waseca not far from the Larson home. And the perpetrator left behind some evidence, a shoe impression from an athletic shoe which had a distinctive zigzag pattern.
A lot of the burglaries had been happening on my shifts, and it was becoming very personal.
On a routine patrol near the burglaries, Officer Markison spotted a man walking along the sidewalk. As Markison drove past, the man abruptly changed direction.
This didn't make a whole lot of sense. It just kind of rolls the hair up on the back of my neck.
So Markison stopped the man to ask a few questions. When he did, he noticed something familiar.
And Markison was able to look down and saw the shoe print in the snow, and that looked like the shoe print that they'd been seeing from some of those burglaries.
And while patting him down, found a large screwdriver and a flashlight in his pocket, burglary tools.
There's no good reason for this guy to be walking in this neighborhood at 8 o'clock at night with a screwdriver and a flashlight in his pocket.
The man was identified as Lorenzo Sanchez, an illegal immigrant from Mexico. In his home, police found stolen property from several burglaries, and police couldn't help but wonder whether Lorenzo Sanchez was also the man who had killed Callie Jo Larson.
Now, I got a little excited about that. In fact, my heart started racing just a hair. Pardon the pun.
That hair was sent for DNA testing. Next, Peterson wanted to see if there were any fingerprints on the plastic sleeves which hold the individual CDs. For that, he used a technique called super glue fuming.
I suspended these 2 CD cases from a rod and then fanned out these plastic sleeves that were on the inside. And what happens, the super glue fumes, as they are emitted from the heat, will adhere to the moisture left behind in a latent print and turn the ridge detail white.
Peterson found only one print on the very last sleeve of the second CD case. The print had a distinctive overlapping loop, one Peterson immediately recognized. The analysis confirmed that it was Callie Jo's right ring fingerprint.
And at that point, I called Bob Berg and said, I think I got something for you.
I said, you got to be shitting me. I knew that he was our guy at that point. I knew it was him.
We weren't finding the suspect's fingerprint on something to put him at the scene. We kind of did this in reverse. We found him in possession with something that came from the scene.
The blonde hair found in the CD case was further confirmation. DNA test showed it belonged to Callie Jo. Despite the evidence, Sanchez denied he was involved in the murder. All the evidence proved was that Sanchez was in possession of a piece of stolen property.
Did you kill Callie Jo Larson?
But police had one last piece of evidence: the 2 foreign hairs recovered from the Larson crime scene. Those hairs, along with a hair sample from Lorenzo Sanchez, were sent to the forensic lab for the newest DNA test available.
Mitochondrial DNA is a specialized DNA test. If you cannot obtain results using nuclear DNA analysis, you'll fall back on mitochondrial DNA testing.
Mitochondria live outside the cell nucleus. For the test, each hair sample is placed into a vial where it changes form into a liquid. The impurities are extracted, leaving only purified DNA. Next, millions of copies are made of just the mitochondria portion and then sequenced. When completed, Dr. Holland could read the genetic code of the hairs from the crime scene.
And so this particular piece of the puzzle suggested that those hairs were in fact from Mr. Sanchez.
The question was, which Mr. Sanchez? Mitochondrial DNA is passed from a mother to her children, all of whom will therefore have the same mitochondrial DNA profile. In other words, the suspect, Lorenzo Sanchez, would have the same mitochondrial DNA as his 6 brothers and sisters. To complicate matters, Lorenzo's younger brother, Miguel, also had a police record and was in Waseca at the time of the murder. The investigation into Callie Jo's murder wasn't over yet.
Soy inocente de eso.
I am innocent of that cause. I did not kill her. It is an injustice what they're doing with me.
Lorenzo Sanchez continued to maintain his innocence in the murder of Callie Jo Larson, even though a CD case with Callie Jo's fingerprint was discovered in Sanchez's home. And 2 hairs found at the crime scene had the same mitochondrial DNA profile as Lorenzo Sanchez.
Mitochondrial DNA is not positive identification, as nuclear DNA is.
Since mitochondrial DNA is passed from a mother to her children, all of the Sanchez siblings would have the same mitochondrial DNA profile. Two of Lorenzo Sanchez's brothers had spent time in Waseca, a younger brother, Miguel, and an older half-brother, Pedro. Pedro said he had an alibi, that he was in Mexico on the day of Cali Joe's murder, which checked out. Miguel Sanchez was in Waseca that day, but his timesheet showed that he was at work at the time of Cali Joe's murder. Lorenzo was the only Sanchez brother with no alibi. His work record showed that he was not at work when the murder occurred. With that, Lorenzo Sanchez was charged with first-degree murder. He maintained his innocence until his sister-in-law visited him in prison, and the two had a conversation that was taped by prison officials.
He specifically says in that conversation, you know, the only thing that they have to link me is the hair. You understand? The hair is the only thing they've got.
And Sanchez asks his sister-in-law to place the blame for Cali Joe's murder on his half-brother Pedro. She refused.
Well, there was apparently some sibling rivalry there, and his brother Pedro had a record which included some violent offenses.
When Lorenzo Sanchez was confronted with the tape of this conversation, he had few choices. He eventually pled guilty to first-degree murder and was convicted. When Cali Joe walked into her home and saw Sanchez in the middle of a burglary, Sanchez silenced the person he thought was the only witness. But there was another witness that day, forensic evidence. The microscopic hair Sanchez left behind and Cali Joe's hair and fingerprint on the CD case told the story. At his sentencing, Connie Larson finally had her chance to speak directly to her daughter's killer.
In his confession and then in his statement after, asked us to forgive him.
Can you?
Well, you know, when you haven't been in this place, it's hard to know what you would do. But being in this place, it hasn't been hard for me. Honestly, on that day, I put it down.
2 years after the crime, Lorenzo Sanchez was sentenced to life in prison.
I know where to start.
Today, Connie Larson works as a social worker with families who've lived through traumatic events. She's also become an advocate for better databases to track criminals like Lorenzo Sanchez, who often slip through the cracks. Cali Joe is never far from her thoughts.
We talk about her constantly. We tell stories about her. We read her notes. She is just a part of what we're doing now today.
Without the forensics, we had nothing. This case was to live or die by the forensic evidence.
Well, it was absolutely critical. We would have not had a case without that forensic evidence. Lorenzo Sanchez would never have been convicted of the murder of Cali Larson without it.
She was home alone, making the dress she planned to wear on her Friday night date. But she had an uninvited visitor. It took 24 years before forensic science could identify the individual who was there that fateful night. It was 1962. President John F. Kennedy was leading the country at the height of the Cold War. The world anxiously watched as the United States confronted the Soviet Union over suspected missile sites in Cuba.
All ships of any kind bound for Cuba where they found they contained cargoes of offensive weapons featuring back.
Racial tensions in the United States weren't as easily deflected. Desegregation of Southern schools pit blacks against whites. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. articulated a message of hope and reason.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up.
Hundreds of miles away, in the small town of Hanford, California, racial tension and the arms race were less important than tending to business and making ends meet.
It was a small community. Everybody knew everybody else. It was all first-name basis. Even all the races were all friendly.
The Miller family provided an important service to the community. They managed the water that was supplied to area farms.
Very neat family, hard worker, Christian people. So the Millers were quite well known.
The canal was located behind their home, and someone from the Miller family was always there to make sure the water system worked properly. On March 21, 1962, 15-year-old Marlene was the one to stay home while her parents left for a night out. Marlene planned to finish sewing a new dress for an upcoming date. Her parents returned home around 10 p.m.
We'll see you next
The
week.
television set was blaring. A screen was missing from a bedroom window, and there was no sign of their daughter. Deputy Sheriff O.R. McFarlane was one of the first to arrive on the scene.
It was obvious that we had a problem. She was, in fact, missing, and there was some foul play somewhere.
Police found tire tracks on the dirt road near the home, and there was other evidence.
There was a set of boot tracks leading out onto Elder Avenue from the dirt lane. There was a set of barefoot tracks leading back into the lane, and which got in and out of the car that was parked there.
Nearby, police discovered a pair of mismatched workman's gloves and a belt. Robert Good was the first journalist on the scene, covering the story for the Fresno Bee newspaper. Once there, he found more than a story.
Started walking down the bank a ways. I walked 150 feet down the bank, and there she was.
Marlene was floating face down in the reservoir behind the family home. Marlene's brother Walt was searching the area in a police helicopter.
And as we flew over the home, I saw the hearse pull up. And at that time, I knew that Marlene had been found.
The autopsy revealed Marlene had been stabbed in the chest, although the wound was not fatal. There was water in her lungs, so the cause of death was drowning. Marlene's wrists were tied behind her back with a knot used by most area dairy farmers.
It had this little knot in it. It was something you could do very quickly and keep the cow from kicking him.
There were no signs of sexual assault, but bruises on the body suggested Marlene bravely fought her attacker. In a search for witnesses, one of Marlene's high school classmates told police he saw a strange car near Marlene's house around the time of her murder.
He said it was aqua-type blue fenders. He liked the paint on the car. Black on the hood and black on the top and black clear down the trunk. High school kid, it kind of, 53 Plymouth looked pretty good to him.
Police had tire impressions at the crime scene and a description of the car. Now, all they had to do was find it. A witness saw a 1953 black and turquoise Plymouth parked near Marlene Miller's home on the night of her murder. Within hours, police found it.
I remember Hanford Police Department came up with a car of that description parked in front of the Royal Hotel in downtown Hanford on 7th Street.
When Deputy Sheriff McFarlane peered inside the rear window, he saw what would later become a crucial piece of evidence.
I could see a pair of boots back there. One was sitting flat and the other was on its side. And with a flashlight, I could see the tread looked to me like the same tread that was out there in Tome Lane.
The car was registered to Booker T. Hillary, Jr., a local dairy worker who had recently been released from prison for a previous rape conviction. One of his co-workers told police that he saw Hillary driving towards Marlene Miller's home after work on the night of her murder. And Hillary's employer identified the gloves found at the crime scene as the ones Hillary wore. The tires on Hillary's car and the boots found in the back seat were similar to the tire and boot impressions in the soft mud near the crime scene.
But that doesn't mean that he killed her, even though the gloves were pitched out down the road where the car tracks had that looked like his went. So everything was circumstantial. There was no real evidence to put him in the home.
Booker Hillary denied any involvement in Marlene's murder. Hillary said he drove by the Millers' home every day since he worked at the dairy farm just down the road. He said his tire and shoe impressions in the area meant nothing. Booker Hillary was arrested, tried, and convicted of Marlene Miller's murder. He was sentenced to death. Once in prison, Hillary took full advantage of the appellate process and petitioned to have his conviction overturned.
It was discouraging, especially for the family that had to constantly relive this nightmare every time this case would come up.
Each time that we go through this process, I keep thinking that maybe this is the last process that they will have to endure. And they just keep coming and coming.
Frustrating. Sometimes the criminal justice system to a police officer is frustrating. All right?
Every appeal Hillary filed was unsuccessful. But in 1974, the United States Supreme Court ruled the death penalty was cruel and unusual punishment. As a result, the sentences of everyone on death row, including Booker Hillary, were commuted to life in prison. The Supreme Court reversed their decision 2 years later, but the commuted death sentences couldn't be reinstated. Booker Hillary's legal maneuvering continued. He appealed his conviction once again, this time claiming that blacks had been excluded from the grand jury that indicted him. In 1983, a judge granted that appeal and ordered Hillary either to be retried or released.
What is disturbing about it is that this was in 1983. The conviction occurred in 1962. And anyone can review the transcripts of the grand jury hearing and determine that, no matter what race you are, you will find probable cause.
Robert Moline was the prosecutor in Booker Hillary's retrial.
I knew that I had to find out exactly what proof I needed because I obviously had to retry this case, and I had to retry it 24 years after the first conviction.
The physical evidence still existed, but 21 of the original witnesses were now dead. Larry Orth was the chief investigator for the Kings County DA's office.
All the people were dead, and to sit and have to read hundreds of pages of testimony from 1962, 65, 1970 into a record of a present-day trial can almost put you to sleep.
So investigators took the physical evidence and looked at it again, this time with some new forensic techniques not previously available, and found a surprise. It had been 24 years since Booker T. Hillary was first convicted of Marlene Miller's murder, a conviction later overturned on appeal. Criminalist Gary Kortner examined the physical evidence from the first trial. He started with the boots found in Booker Hillary's car on the night of the murder. The boots had been modified. The soles were the originals from the Wellington Boot Company, but the original white heel had been replaced with a black one.
He did this to keep his shoes from wearing out as fast, and in doing that he made almost an individual shoe out of it because of the two different components.
Kortner compared Hillary's boots to the shoe impression found near Marlene Miller's home. They had the same sole, the same custom heel, and the same 5 individual cut marks in the heel. Next, Kortner compared the tires from Hillary's car to the tire impressions found on the dirt road near the Millers' home.
We were looking for cuts or rocks or anything that had been in the tires. And in this case, we were very lucky because there was a manufacturer's defect that was picked up, and there were 3 cuts in the tires very close to that.
This placed Booker Hillary in the vicinity of the crime scene, but not inside the home. Larry Orth found something important while reading through the transcripts from the first trial. On the night of the murder, 24 years earlier, an alert detective asked Marlene's mother to vacuum the carpet in the living room where her daughter was abducted. At that time, investigators found some unusual microscopic particles in that trace evidence, but they didn't know what they were.
And he said they didn't have the technology to do it other than just to compare them as far as shape, size, and that was it.
The football-shaped particles found in the vacuum cleaner bag still existed in the evidence file and were sent for analysis to an independent forensic lab in Chicago. Skip Palahniuk was the forensic microscopist assigned to the case.
Having done microscopy since I was 8 years old, I had seen particles like this before, and I knew what kinds of physical phenomena produce this.
Under magnification of 300 times, Palahniuk recognized the particles as paint, the kind sprayed from an aerosol can. Throughout the particles were cotton fibers. This explained why the paint particles were round. When paint is sprayed from an aerosol can, the round particles flatten when they hit a surface like wood. When the paint dries, it creates a film-like covering. But if the spray paint hits a fiber, it reacts differently.
If these spheres dry around nothing, they just retain that shape, that is, they're spheres. However, if they come in contact with a fiber, then what happens is capillary forces cause the ends of the sphere, which starts out like this, to draw out where they come in contact with the fiber.
Scientists performed an electron probe microanalysis to identify the elements in the paint.
Every element that's in there has its own X-rays that come off. There are different wavelengths. And we collect these different X-rays at different wavelengths or different energies. And from their energy or their wavelength, we can tell what elements are present in the sample.
The components were titanium, lead, and iron. An infrared microspectrophotometer, which looks more like a computer than a microscope, determined the paint's molecular composition. The results are charted on a graph, and scientists learned that the paint was an oil-based alkyd with a Prussian blue pigment. Investigators now wanted to know where these mysterious microscopic blue paint particles came from. And they also needed to know how they got onto Marlene Miller's living room carpet 24 years earlier. As prosecutors prepared to retry Booker T. Hillary for the murder of Marlene Miller, they discovered new forensic evidence, microscopic paint particles in the victim's home encased in cotton, But in 1962, at the time of the original trial, the technology to identify these particles didn't exist. But where did these paintballs come from? For answers, investigators looked once more inside Booker Hillary's 1953 Plymouth automobile. Surprisingly, it was still in police custody after all those years. In the forensic lab, scientists noticed that the ceiling of the passenger compartment was lined with a cotton material, and the material had been painted with a blue spray paint.
And pulling some of the headliner off and examining it under the microscope, I realized that there were millions of these things that had been manufactured by him and spraying the headliner. And they were still there. It was kind of like they were there for someone to find, and I was lucky enough to be the one that found them.
Scientists vacuumed the inside of Hillary's car and analyzed the trace evidence. They found thousands of paint particles identical in color, shape, and chemical makeup to those found in Marlene Miller's home.
At the end of all this analysis, what we have are, first of all, green paint spheres. The paint is alkyd enamel. It's the same in both question and no. It has the same color. When you crush up little bits under the microscope, they show the same kinds of crystalline fillers that are inside. The elemental composition is identical. The infrared spectrum showing the molecular composition is identical. They both use Prussian blue.
We couldn't say that it came from the same spray can. We're just saying, how did they get there? They're so unusual in shape. Why are they in both places?
Investigators suspected that Booker Hillary spray painted the interior roof of his car. As he did, the round paint particles attached to the cotton fibers and remained cylindrical as they dried. Driving around town, when Hillary hit a bump in the road, the microscopic particles shed, landing on his clothing and in his hair.
These paintballs just followed him around like a virus, and he didn't know they were there.
Prosecutors believe that when Hillary entered Marlene's home on the night of her murder, those microscopic paint particles dropped onto the Millers' living room floor.
He became literally a walking trace evidence factory.
This evidence placed Booker Hillary inside Marlene's home.
We had everything else outside and a tenth of a mile away, but the paintballs put him in the house. That's how important they are.
In 1986, based on this new forensic evidence, Booker T. Hillary was tried and convicted once again for the murder of 15-year-old Marlene Miller. He was sentenced to the maximum penalty allowed, 25 years to life, although the judge made it clear that he would have imposed the death penalty if he had been permitted by law to do so. Ironically, it was Booker Hillary himself who handed investigators the forensic evidence used to convict him. Local authorities had tried to sell his car shortly after his first conviction in the 1960s, but Hillary wouldn't allow it.
He in turn filed a motion in federal court suing the county to stop him from getting rid of the car. He dismissed the case and we decided not to sell it. And thank you, Mr. Hillary.
When I looked up that day in the garage and having seen that sprayed headliner was just indescribable, I said, this is it. Had he have not saved the car for us, I would have never known where these particles came from.
Today, Booker Hillary is 71 years old. He was denied parole at his most recent hearing in January 2003.
Booker Hillary is where he belongs. He should have been in the gas chamber before this, but for whatever reason, the system didn't take his life, but he is where he belongs. He does not belong back out in society.
Investigators credit the foresight of the late Art Thomas, the Kings County Chief Criminal Deputy, who in 1962 insisted that Marlene's mother vacuumed the living room floor where the abduction took place. He kept that trace evidence in police custody.
That was the key to it, and I know Art knew that was the key to putting him in the house back then. He was an investigator, and he was a damn good cop.
We can do what some people think can only be done in works of fiction. We are, I believe, the living embodiment of Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Thorndike and some of these kinds of people, and that we can take this little speck of evidence and literally make it speak.
The desert had kept its secret for 40 years. Under the endless Arizona sun, where abandoned roads disappeared into miles of empty land and forgotten places slowly became swallowed by dust, one question remained unanswered. Who killed Daniel Harper? For decades, his name existed only inside a cold case file, a photograph, a few handwritten reports, a family that refused to stop waiting, and a murder scene that investigators believed would never reveal the truth. But everything changed when a retired police officer made one final call, a call that reopened a forgotten investigation, a call that exposed a hidden connection buried beneath decades of silence, a call that finally brought investigators back to a crime scene where the killer believed nothing would ever be found. It was the early morning hours of September 14th, 1982, a quiet desert road outside a small Arizona town, the kind of place where people knew every neighbor, where strangers were noticed, where everyone believed nothing truly terrible could happen. But before sunrise, a passing truck driver noticed something unusual near an abandoned mining route. A vehicle, parked at an angle, the driver's door slightly open. No movement, no lights, no explanation. The driver stopped several yards away. At first, he assumed someone had abandoned the car. A broken engine, a forgotten vehicle, a simple problem. Then he noticed something through the windshield, a person's hand. The driver immediately called authorities. Within minutes, the quiet desert road became a crime scene. Inside the vehicle was 34-year-old Daniel Harper, a local mechanic, a father, a man known throughout the community as someone who helped others. He repaired cars for families who could not afford expensive shops. He worked long hours. He rarely caused problems. And according to everyone who knew him, he had no enemies. But the evidence told a different story. Daniel had been murdered. The attack was violent, personal. Investigators immediately recognized something unusual. This was not a random robbery. Nothing valuable had been taken. His wallet remained inside. His watch remained on his wrist. The killer was not searching for money. The killer was sending a message. The first officers arriving at the scene were overwhelmed by questions. Why was Daniel on that isolated road? Who had contacted him? Why would someone he knew want him dead? And most importantly, who had enough hatred to commit such a brutal crime? Detective Robert Hayes led the initial investigation. He had spent 12 years working major cases across Arizona. He understood criminals. He understood patterns. And from the beginning, he believed one thing. The person responsible knew Daniel. The killer had access. The killer had trust. And the killer had a reason. Investigators began rebuilding Daniel's final day. The timeline was simple, but one detail stood out. Daniel had left his home after receiving a late-night phone call. His wife, Laura, remembered the moment clearly. She told investigators Daniel looked surprised, not afraid, not angry, just confused. She asked who called. Daniel only said, "Someone needs my help." Those were the last words she ever heard from him. The phone record became the first major clue. But when investigators checked the calls from Daniel's home, they found something strange. The call did not appear. Someone had contacted Daniel, but the record had disappeared. At the time, technology was limited. Tracking calls was difficult. Missing information was common. But investigators believed the missing call mattered. Someone had wanted that conversation erased. The investigation expanded. Friends were interviewed. Co-workers were questioned. Every person connected to Daniel was examined. But the case quickly became complicated. Everyone described Daniel the same way. Helpful, quiet, reliable. The type of person who would stop to help a stranger on the side of the road. The type of person who remembered birthdays. the type of person who never looked for trouble. But hidden beneath that image was something investigators discovered later. Daniel had been investigating something himself. 3 weeks before his death, he began asking questions about an old mining company, a company that had closed years earlier, a company connected to missing financial records, a company connected to land disputes, a company that several residents believed had hidden something important. Daniel never told anyone exactly what he found, but he had started keeping notes, and those notes disappeared after his murder. Investigators searched his garage, his workplace, his home. Nothing. The notebook was gone. The only evidence that Daniel had been investigating something came from one person, a retired police officer named Frank Miller. Miller had worked in the area during the 1980s. He was one of the first officers who responded to Daniel's murder. At the time, he believed the case would be solved quickly, but it wasn't. The lead stopped. The witnesses disappeared. The evidence went cold. Years passed, then decades, and Daniel Harper became another name on a forgotten list of unsolved murders. But Frank Miller never forgot, because he believed one piece of information had been overlooked, a small detail, a detail everyone ignored. The night Daniel was killed, someone else was seen near the desert road, a second vehicle, a dark pickup truck. Miller remembered because the driver stopped when police arrived. He gave a statement. Then he disappeared from the investigation. His name was removed from later reports. The reason? Nobody knew. Miller tried bringing it up several times over the years. But the case had already lost attention. New investigators came. Old investigators retired. Files moved. Records disappeared. Eventually, the murder became a forgotten case. Until 40 years later, in 2022, Frank Miller was living quietly outside Phoenix. He was in his late 70s. His police career was long behind him, but he still kept old case files, old notes, old memories. And one night, while looking through those documents, he found something that stopped him. A name he had seen before. A name connected to the dark pickup truck. A name connected to Daniel Harper. A name that had never been properly investigated. Miller immediately knew what he had found. The person who killed Daniel might have been hiding in plain sight for 40 years. The next morning, he made the call that changed everything. He contacted investigators, and he said 5 words that reopened one of Arizona's most haunting cold cases. I know who did it. The words from retired Officer Frank Miller traveled through the department like a shockwave. I know who did it. For 40 years, investigators had searched through dead ends, forgotten witnesses, and missing pieces of evidence. Now, an elderly former officer was claiming the answer had been sitting inside the case file all along. But Miller did not simply provide a name. He provided a story about a mistake made in 1982, a mistake that allowed a killer to walk away, and a secret that remained hidden because nobody thought one small detail mattered. When detectives reopened the Harper case, they expected faded memories and unreliable information. Instead, Miller brought something unexpected, a notebook, his personal investigation notes from 1982, pages he had written during the first weeks after Daniel Harper's murder, notes that were never added to the official case file. Inside those pages was a detail that changed everything. Miller had written about the dark pickup truck, the vehicle seen near the murder scene. But unlike the official report, Miller recorded the license plate. The original investigation file had no mention of it. The plate number was missing. The witness statement was incomplete. The vehicle had disappeared from the case. But Miller's notebook had preserved the information. The detectives entered the plate number into the modern database. The result came back within seconds. The truck had belonged to a man named Richard Cole, a local businessman, a person who had never been considered a suspect, a person who had lived in Arizona for decades, the same person who was still alive. The discovery immediately raised questions. Why was Richard Cole never investigated? Why was his vehicle near the scene? Why did his name disappear from the original investigation. Detectives began examining Cole's history. At first, nothing appeared unusual. He was respected in the community. He owned several properties. He donated money to local projects. He was known as a successful businessman, the kind of person nobody wanted to accuse. But the deeper investigators looked, the more strange details appeared. Richard Cole had known Daniel Harper, not casually, closely. Years before the murder, Daniel had worked on vehicles owned by Cole's company. The two men had a professional relationship, but according to witnesses, that relationship changed months before Daniel's death. They had argued repeatedly. The reason was unclear until investigators found an old document, a financial report, hidden inside Daniel's old business records. The report showed that Daniel had discovered irregularities in one of Cole's companies. Money was missing. Payments were unexplained. Several transactions had no clear purpose. Daniel had noticed something wrong, and he started asking questions. The same questions that might have gotten him killed. Investigators interviewed former employees who had worked with Cole. One former accountant agreed to speak. He told detectives that Daniel had approached him weeks before the murder. Daniel believed someone was stealing from the company, but he did not know how high the corruption went. The accountant remembered Daniel saying, "If I am right, someone is going to get very nervous." Those words suddenly changed the entire investigation. Daniel Harper was not randomly murdered. He was silenced. The detectives then turned their attention back to Richard Cole. They discovered something else. On the night Daniel died, Cole claimed he was at home, alone, no witnesses, no proof, a perfect alibi. Too perfect. The original investigators had questioned Cole, but they accepted his statement. Why? Because everyone trusted him. He was a respected businessman, a community leader, someone people believed was incapable of violence. But 40 years later, detectives viewed him differently. They did not see a successful businessman. They saw someone who had a motive, a connection, and an unexplained presence near the crime scene. Investigators requested permission to interview Cole. He agreed. The meeting took place in a quiet office. Cole was now in his 80s, older, slower, but still confident. When detectives placed Daniel's photograph on the table, his expression changed, only for a moment. But they noticed. They asked about the dark pickup truck. Cole admitted it was his. He said he had driven near the area that night, but he claimed he was only passing through. A coincidence. Nothing more. Then detectives showed him Miller's notebook, the handwritten record, the forgotten license plate. Cole stared at the page, and for the first time, he looked nervous. He asked one question. Who kept that? The detectives answered, Frank Miller. Cole looked away. That reaction told investigators something important. Richard Cole remembered Frank Miller, and he remembered what happened that night. The interview continued for 2 hours. Cole denied killing Daniel. He denied knowing about the missing documents. He denied everything. But before leaving, he said something strange, something detectives could not ignore. He said, "You should ask why Daniel trusted the wrong person." Then he walked away. The statement created a new mystery. If Cole was responsible, why suggest someone else? Was he trying to confuse investigators? Or was he revealing another hidden connection? Detectives returned to Daniel's final days. They looked again at the phone call, the missing call that brought Daniel to the desert road. This time, they searched deeper. They found old phone company records stored on microfilm. Most had been destroyed, but one record survived. A handwritten note from a technician. The note showed the call had come from a payphone, not from Cole's home, not from his office. A payphone located near Daniel's workplace, a place where many people could have used it. The killer had not called from a private location. They had called from somewhere public. Someone wanted to make the call impossible to trace. Then investigators found another clue, a witness, a person who had never been interviewed in 1982, a woman who worked at a nearby gas station. She remembered seeing Daniel that night. She remembered someone else, a man standing near the payphone, watching, waiting, and when detectives showed her a photograph of Richard Cole, she shook her head. No. Then she pointed to another photograph, a name, a person connected to Daniel, someone investigators had never suspected, someone who had helped search for Daniel after his death, someone who had stood beside the family for 40 years. The witness whispered, "That is the man I saw." The photograph belonged to Michael Harper, Daniel Harper's younger brother. The name on the photograph changed the entire investigation. Michael Harper, Daniel Harper's younger brother. For 40 years, Michael had been known as one of the people who suffered the most from the murder. He stood beside Daniel's wife. He attended every memorial. He spoke publicly about wanting justice. He told reporters that Daniel deserved answers. He was the grieving brother, the loyal family member, the person everyone believed had lost someone he loved. But now, a witness was placing him near the scene, not decades later, not by coincidence. On the night Daniel Harper died, detectives returned to the original case file. They searched every interview, every statement, every note written by investigators, and they found something disturbing. Michael Harper had never been treated as a possible suspect. Not once. The reason was simple. Nobody wanted to believe it. The investigators in 1982 focused entirely on strangers, business disputes, unknown criminals, random violence. They searched the desert. They followed rumors. They chased theories. But they never looked closely at the people closest to Daniel. The cold case team now had to ask the question everyone avoided for 4 decades. Did Michael Harper know more than he admitted? The first thing they examined was a relationship between the brothers. Publicly, they were close, but private records showed a different picture. Daniel was successful, stable, respected. Michael struggled. He changed jobs often. He had financial problems. He borrowed money from family members. And according to several witnesses, he depended heavily on Daniel. The detectives discovered that months before the murder, Daniel had stopped helping him financially. The reason? Daniel believed Michael was making dangerous choices. He refused to continue giving him money. That decision created tension between the brothers, a tension nobody talked about after Daniel died. Investigators found an old letter written by Daniel, a personal note that had been stored in a family box for decades. The letter was never sent. It was unfinished. But one paragraph stood out. Daniel wrote, "I want to help you, but I can't keep fixing problems you refuse to solve." The message suggested a relationship under pressure, not hatred, not necessarily violence, but conflict. The detectives needed more. They examined the night Daniel was killed. Michael's original statement said he was at home, alone. He claimed he had no idea where Daniel went. But investigators found a problem: the payphone location. The same payphone used to call Daniel was less than 10 minutes from Michael's apartment. And there was more. A neighbor remembered seeing Michael leave his home late that evening. The neighbor assumed he was going to meet someone, but nobody ever asked. The old witness statement had been buried in unrelated paperwork. 40 years later, it became a critical piece of evidence. The detectives contacted Michael Harper, now in his 70s, living quietly in another state. When investigators requested an interview, he refused at first. Then, after several days, he agreed. The meeting was tense. Michael arrived carrying a folder. Inside were newspaper articles about Daniel's murder. He had kept them all. Every headline, every update, every anniversary story. Detectives noticed something. Michael knew every detail, almost too well. They asked him about the gas station witness. The moment they mentioned the payphone, his expression changed. He looked down, then said, "After 40 years, you're still looking in the wrong place." The detectives asked, "What does that mean?" Michael answered, "Daniel wasn't killed because of money." A pause. "He was killed because he found out who people really were." The statement sounded like a confession, But Michael continued. He claimed Daniel discovered something about Richard Cole, something much bigger than financial fraud. According to Michael, Daniel found evidence connecting Cole to an illegal land operation, a scheme involving stolen property, false documents, and people inside local government. Michael said Daniel planned to expose it, but he never got the chance. The detectives asked, "If you knew this, why didn't you tell anyone in 1982? Michael remained silent. Then he said, "Because I was afraid." The answer created another mystery. Afraid of whom? Richard Cole? The people involved in the land operation? Or someone else? Investigators pushed harder. They asked about the payphone. Michael denied making the call. He denied following Daniel. He denied killing him. But then detectives asked one final question. Why did the witness identify you? Michael looked away and whispered, "Because she saw me." The room went silent. It sounded like an admission, but Michael's next words changed everything. "I was there." The investigators froze. Michael explained that he did go to the payphone. He did follow Daniel, but he claimed he was not there to hurt him. He was there to warn him. Michael said Daniel had discovered something dangerous, something involving Richard Cole, something that could destroy powerful people. He wanted Daniel to stop, to walk away. But when he arrived, someone else was already there. Michael claimed he saw another person near Daniel's vehicle, a person wearing a dark jacket, a person he recognized, a person who should not have been there. The detectives asked, "Who?" Michael looked directly at them, then gave a name that created another shock, because it belonged to the first detective who investigated Daniel Harper's murder, Detective Alan Pierce, the original lead investigator, the man who controlled the first case, the man who decided which leads mattered, the man who chose which suspects to ignore. Michael claimed Detective Pierce arrived before officers were called. He claimed Pierce removed something from Daniel's vehicle, evidence, something that could have solved the murder in 1982. The detectives immediately searched Pierce's history and found something unexpected. After Daniel's murder, Pierce left the department. Official reason: health issues. But financial records showed he received money from an unknown source shortly after closing the case. A payment, a large one. The investigation had now uncovered 3 connected names: Richard Cole, Michael Harper, Detective Alan Pierce. 3 men connected to Daniel Harper's final night. 3 possible secrets. But only one could explain what happened. Then investigators received a new piece of evidence: a retired officer's tip, a forgotten photograph, and a handwritten note from Detective Frank Miller. The note contained a sentence he had written in 1982, a sentence he never shared. The killer was not running away. The killer was waiting for us to stop looking. And after 40 years, someone had finally started looking again. The investigation that began with a single retired officer's phone call had now become something much larger: a murder, a missing phone record, a hidden financial trail, and 3 men connected to Daniel Harper's final night: Richard Cole, Michael Harper, Detective Alan Pierce. For 40 years, each of them carried a different version of the truth, but only one version could explain what happened on that lonely Arizona road. Detectives began with Alan Pierce, the original lead investigator, the man who had controlled the direction of the case from beginning, the man whose decisions shaped everything that followed. When the cold case team reviewed Pierce's work, they immediately noticed something unusual. The investigation was not careless. It was selective. Certain evidence was collected quickly. Other evidence was ignored. Some witnesses were interviewed multiple times. Others were never contacted. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Someone had not simply failed to solve Daniel Harper's murder. Someone had controlled what investigators were allowed to discover. The first major discovery involved Daniel's vehicle. The official report stated that investigators found no significant evidence inside. No fingerprints. No documents. No connection to a suspect. But modern forensic review revealed something different. A photograph taken at the scene showed the passenger seat. On the seat was a small object, a notebook. Daniel's missing notebook. The same notebook investigators believe disappeared after his death, but the notebook was never mentioned in the official report. The evidence photo proved it existed. Someone removed it before the final report was written, and according to the original chain of custody, only a few people had access to the vehicle. One of them was Detective Alan Pierce. The cold case team requested Pierce's old personnel records. They found something hidden, a disciplinary complaint from another officer. The complaint accused Pierce of interfering with evidence during a previous investigation. The complaint was dismissed. The reason listed, lack of sufficient proof. But Frank Miller remembered the incident. He remembered because Pierce reacted differently when questioned. He wasn't angry, Miller later told investigators. He was worried. That detail became important because Pierce was not a reckless criminal. He was careful. He understood police procedures. He knew how to hide things, and that made him more dangerous. Investigators located Pierce. He was living in a small retirement community outside Tucson. When detectives arrived, he did not appear surprised, almost as if he expected them. The first thing he asked was, "Did Miller finally talk?" The detectives looked at each other. They had not mentioned Miller. They had not mentioned the retired officer's tip. But Pierce already knew. That single sentence changed the interview. Pierce knew something. The question was, how much? They placed Daniel Harper's photograph on the table. Pierce looked at it for several seconds. Then he said, "That case should stay buried." The detectives immediately noticed the wording. Not forgotten. Not unsolved. Buried. They asked him what he meant. Pierce refused to answer. He claimed he had followed procedure. He claimed the original investigation was thorough. He claimed everyone was chasing rumors. But then detectives showed him the evidence photograph, the notebook, the object that officially did not exist. Pierce became silent. For the first time, the confidence disappeared. He asked, "Who found that?" The detectives answered, "We did." Pierce looked down, then whispered, "You have no idea what you're dealing with." The detectives asked, "Who killed Daniel Harper?" Pierce did not answer. Instead, he said something unexpected. Daniel wasn't supposed to die. The statement changed everything, because it suggested something investigators had not considered. Maybe Daniel was not the intended victim. Maybe the murder was a mistake. Maybe the killer was trying to stop something else. The detectives returned to Daniel's investigation notes. The missing notebook became the center of the case. They believed it contained what Daniel discovered before his death. But where was it now? The answer came from an unexpected source. Frank Miller, the retired officer, admitted he had another reason for calling. He had found something inside his old police storage box. A torn piece of paper. A page from Daniel's notebook. He had forgotten about it. For 40 years. The page contained only a few lines. But those lines revealed the entire reason Daniel was in danger. Daniel had written, "Cole is not the only one. Someone inside knows. Someone wearing the badge." The final sentence was unfinished, but it was enough. Daniel was not only investigating Richard Cole. He had discovered corruption inside law enforcement. Someone within the police department was protecting the operation, and that person had access to everything. Evidence, reports, witness statements, the investigation itself. The detectives looked at Alan Pierce. He was no longer just a former investigator. He was a suspect. But before they could act, another discovery emerged. A DNA test on evidence recovered from Daniel's vehicle. A sample taken in 1982, stored and forgotten. The technology did not exist back then, but now it did. The laboratory processed the sample. The result came back 2 weeks later. A match. Not Richard Cole. Not Michael Harper. Not Alan Pierce. A completely different person. Someone nobody had considered. Someone who had never appeared in any report. The DNA belonged to Frank Miller, the the retired officer who reopened the case, the man who claimed he wanted justice, the man who gave investigators a clue that started everything. The detective stared at the result. The case had turned again. The person who solved the mystery was now connected to the crime. And for the first time in 40 years, the question was no longer, who killed Daniel Harper? The question became, why did Frank Miller wait so long to reveal the truth? The DNA result changed everything. For 40 years, Frank Miller had been remembered as the retired officer who never forgot Daniel Harper, the man who carried an old notebook, the man who preserved a forgotten clue, the man who finally gave investigators the missing piece. But now his name appeared in the same investigation he helped reopen. The DNA recovered from Daniel Harper's vehicle matched Frank Miller, a discovery nobody expected, a discovery that created a new possibility. What if Miller was not the person who solved the case? What if he was the person who had hidden the truth? The cold case team immediately reviewed the DNA result. They knew the science. They knew the limitations. A match did not automatically prove murder. The sample could have come from innocent contact, an officer responding to the scene, a person handling evidence, a mistake made decades earlier. But one question remained. Why was Frank Miller's DNA found inside Daniel's vehicle? The retired officer was contacted again. This time, the conversation was different. He was not a witness. He was a person of interest. When detectives arrived at his home, Miller already seemed to know why they were there. He looked at the evidence bag, the laboratory report, the photograph of Daniel's vehicle. Then he sat down. For several seconds, he said nothing. Finally, he spoke. I knew this day would come. The detectives asked, "Why?" Miller looked toward the window, because the truth always catches up. But when investigators asked if he killed Daniel, Miller immediately shook his head. "No." "Then explain your DNA." Miller closed his eyes, and for the first time, he told the story he had kept hidden for 40 years. The night Daniel Harper died, Miller was not just responding as an officer. He was there before the official police arrival, because Daniel had contacted him, not Detective Pierce, not the department. Frank Miller. Daniel trusted him. The detectives asked why. Miller explained that years earlier, Daniel had helped him repair his truck. They became friends. Not close friends, but enough that Daniel believed Miller was someone he could trust. 3 days before his death, Daniel called him. He said he had discovered something dangerous, something involving Richard Cole, something involving people inside law enforcement. Daniel wanted advice. Miller told him to bring everything he had, but Daniel never arrived at the meeting place. Instead, he was found dead. Miller explained that when he heard about the murder, he went to the scene before his supervisors arrived. He found Daniel's vehicle. He found the notebook. He found evidence. But he also found something else. A second person. Someone standing near the vehicle. Detective Alan Pierce. The same person Michael Harper later claimed he saw. Miller said Pierce was not supposed to be there. He was not assigned to the case yet, but he arrived first, and he was searching through Daniel's belongings. Miller confronted him. Pierce threatened him, not directly, not with violence, but with a warning. If you want to keep your badge, you forget what you saw. Miller said he was afraid, not for himself, for his family, for his career. He was a young officer. Pierce was respected, connected, powerful. So Miller made a decision he regretted every day afterward. He stayed silent. The detectives asked, "Then why call now?" Miller looked down. "Because I was tired of carrying it." He explained that after retiring, he spent years thinking about Daniel. Every anniversary, every newspaper article, every time the family asked for answers, he knew he had failed them. But there was another reason, something he discovered recently, a reason he believed Daniel's killer was still alive and still hiding. Miller revealed that 2 months before contacting investigators, he received an envelope, no return address. Inside was a photograph, A photograph taken in 1982. The image showed Daniel Harper standing outside the abandoned mining route, but he was not alone. Standing beside him was Detective Alan Pierce, and between them was a third person, someone who had never appeared in the investigation. Miller placed a photograph on the table. The detectives studied it carefully. The third person was holding a folder, the same type of folder used by police investigators, the same type of folder that contained Daniel's missing evidence. Then they recognized the face. It was not Richard Cole, not Michael Harper, not anyone they had investigated. It was a man who had worked inside the county administration, a person with access to property records, a person who approved land transfers, a person connected to every suspicious financial document found during the investigation. His name, Victor Hale. The detective searched Hale's background and immediately found problems. In 1982, he worked as a county records supervisor. He controlled property documents, land ownership files, transfer approvals, exactly the records Daniel had been investigating. But Hale was never interviewed, never questioned, never mentioned, because nobody knew he was connected. Until now, the investigation changed direction again. Richard Cole might have had the motive. Alan Pierce might have covered it up. Michael Harper might have known more. But Victor Hale had access to the information that started everything. The detectives searched Hale's old records. They found something shocking. 3 days after Daniel's death, Hale approved a major property transfer, a transfer involving land near the old mining route, the same area where Daniel was found, the same land Daniel had been investigating. And the buyer? A company connected to Richard Cole. The entire case connected again. Money. Property. Police. Missing evidence. But the biggest question remained. Who actually killed Daniel Harper? Investigators brought in Richard Cole again. This time, they showed him the photograph. Cole stared at Victor Hale's face, and his reaction was immediate. Fear, not anger. Not surprise. Fear. He whispered, "He's not supposed to be in this." The detectives asked, "Who?" Cole looked at them, then said, "Daniel wasn't investigating me." A pause. He was investigating Victor. The room went silent. Cole continued. Daniel found out what Victor was doing. What was he doing? Cole looked at the old photograph, then answered, buying silence. The investigation had reached a new level. Daniel Harper was not murdered because he discovered corruption. He was murdered because he discovered who controlled it. And somewhere in Arizona, the person who ordered his death had spent 40 years believing the desert would hide the truth forever. The name Victor Hale changed the entire shape of the investigation. For decades, investigators searched for a killer, a person driven by anger, a person with a personal reason to hurt Daniel Harper. But now the evidence suggested something much colder. Daniel was not killed because of a personal conflict. He was killed because he discovered a system, a network built on money, influence, and silence. Victor Hale had spent 40 years invisible. He was never the headline, never the suspect, never the person people whispered about. He was the man behind the paperwork, the person who moved documents from one desk to another, the person who could make a property disappear from official records, the person who could make a crime look like a misunderstanding, and that made him dangerous. The cold case investigators began rebuilding Victor Hale's connection to Daniel Harper. They discovered Daniel had been tracking property changes around the abandoned mining area for months. At first, everyone assumed Daniel was looking into Richard Cole, but the records showed something else. Daniel's notes mentioned Victor Hale repeatedly, not as a suspect, as a mystery. Daniel had written, "Why does every road lead back to Hale?" That single sentence became one of the most important discoveries in the case, because Daniel had not found Victor by accident. He had followed the evidence. The detectives searched through archived county records. Most were incomplete. Some were missing, but modern digital restoration recovered information hidden in damaged files. The results were disturbing. Between 1979 and 1982, dozens of properties changed ownership around the mining region. Families who had lived there for generations suddenly sold their land. Many claimed they were pressured. Others said they were offered money they could not refuse. And every transfer passed through one office, Victor Hale's office. The records showed a pattern. When people resisted selling, problems appeared. Tax issues, legal threats, false complaints, small pressures that eventually became impossible to ignore. Daniel Harper had discovered it, and he had started collecting proof. But investigators still needed to know one thing. Who ordered him killed? Victor Hale? Richard Cole? Someone else? The answer seemed closer when detectives located another witness, a former county employee named Sarah Whitman. She had worked under Victor Hale in 1982. For 40 years, she had refused every interview request. But after hearing that the case was reopened, she contacted investigators herself. Her first words were, "I thought nobody would ever ask again." Sarah told detectives that Victor Hale was not acting alone. He rarely made decisions himself. He received instructions from people above him, people with more power, people who could erase problems. She explained that Hale's job was simple. He controlled records. He changed paperwork. He made things disappear. But someone else decided what needed to disappear. The detectives asked, "Who?" Sarah hesitated, then answered, "Someone from inside the police department." The room became silent. Again, the same pattern, the same hidden connection, law enforcement. Sarah revealed that before Daniel died, Victor Hale met several times with Detective Alan Pierce. Not officially. No reports. No records. Just private meetings. Investigators immediately returned to Pierce. The former detective had already admitted he knew more than he revealed. But now they had another connection. A reason. A possible agreement. The question became, was Pierce protecting Hale, or was Hale controlling Pierce? The answer came from a forgotten audio recording. A recording nobody knew existed. In 1982, Sarah secretly recorded a conversation because she feared losing her job. The audio quality was poor. The voices were faint. But one voice was unmistakable. Victor Hale. The other voice belonged to Alan Pierce. The conversation was short, but devastating. Pierce said, "Harper knows too much." Hale replied, "Then make sure he stops talking." The recording ended there. No direct confession, no mention of murder, but enough to change everything. The investigators now had evidence connecting two powerful figures, but they still lacked the final piece, the person who physically killed Daniel. Then came another breakthrough. The DNA evidence from Daniel's vehicle was re-examined. The first test matched Frank Miller, but investigators discovered something important. The sample contained more than one person's DNA. Miller's DNA was there because he touched the vehicle at the scene. But another sample was also present, a second unknown male profile. The original laboratory technology could not separate it. Modern testing could. The new analysis began. Everyone waited. Richard Cole, Alan Pierce, Victor Hale, Michael Harper. Every name connected to the case. Then the result arrived. The DNA did not match any of them. The killer was someone else. A person nobody had investigated. A person who had no official connection to the case. Until investigators found an old photograph. The same photograph Miller had kept hidden. The third person standing beside Daniel and Pierce. The person holding the folder. The person who disappeared from the investigation. The photograph was enhanced. The face became clearer. And detectives finally identified him. His name was Thomas Vance, a former security contractor. A man hired by several companies connected to Richard Cole. A man who had worked in the mining region. A man who had no reason to appear in the police investigation, but he did. And his DNA matched the unknown sample. The case had finally reached the person who pulled the trigger. But investigators discovered something even more disturbing. Thomas Vance had not acted alone, because before he disappeared from Arizona in 1983, he left behind a letter addressed to Victor Hale, and inside that letter was one sentence. "You promised nobody would ever find out who gave the order." The detectives stared at the words, because for 40 years they believed they were searching for a murderer, but the evidence now showed something different. The killer was only one piece. Someone else gave the order. Someone who had never been questioned. Someone who had remained hidden behind every layer of conspiracy. And when investigators searched the final page of Daniel Harper's recovered notes, they found one last name. A name Daniel wrote just hours before he died. A name he circled 3 times. The name of the person he believed was controlling everything. Arizona State Senator William Cross. The name William Cross changed the investigation from a murder case into a political earthquake. For 40 years, Daniel Harper's death had been treated as a local tragedy, a mechanic, a quiet desert road, a violent crime that left a family without answers. But the recovered notes revealed something much larger. Daniel had not stumbled into corruption. He uncovered a chain of influence reaching far beyond one town. And at the center of that chain was a name nobody expected: a state senator, a powerful public figure, a man who built his entire career on trust. William Cross. When detectives began investigating Cross, they found a carefully constructed public image. He was considered a respected politician, a voice for rural communities, a supporter of economic development. He had spent decades appearing at community events, opening businesses, meeting families, giving speeches about honesty and progress. But hidden behind that image was another story, a story involving land, money, and people who disappeared when they became inconvenient. The cold case team reviewed every property transfer connected to Victor Hale, every company connected to Richard Cole, every document signed after Daniel Harper's death. And slowly, a pattern appeared. William Cross was connected to almost all of it. Not directly. Never directly. That was what made him difficult to investigate. He never signed the suspicious documents. He never appeared in official records. He never stood beside the people making the deals. He stayed above it, at least publicly. But Daniel Harper had noticed something, a connection hidden in the paperwork, a series of donations, companies giving money to political campaigns, businesses receiving government contracts shortly afterward, the same companies buying land around the abandoned mining area. Daniel had written one sentence in his notebook: "The money does not stop at coal. It goes higher." Investigators believed Daniel was preparing to expose the entire network, but before he could reveal it, he was murdered. The question now was whether William Cross knew about the plan, or whether he ordered it. Detectives searched through old campaign records. They discovered something unexpected. In 1982, shortly before Daniel's death, Richard Cole's company donated a large amount of money to an organization connected to Cross. The donation was legal on paper, but the timing was suspicious. The money arrived only weeks after Daniel began investigating Cole's business. Then came another discovery: Victor Hale's daughter. She had never spoken publicly about her father's work, but when investigators contacted her, she agreed to meet. She carried a box. Inside were old letters, personal documents, and one photograph. The photograph showed Victor Hale at a private gathering, standing beside Richard Cole, Alan Pierce, and William Cross. The date: August 1982, 1 month before Daniel Harper was murdered. The image was devastating because it proved something investigators had suspected. These men knew each other. They worked together. But it still did not prove murder. Then Victor Hale's daughter revealed something even more important. She said her father was terrified near the end of his life. Not guilty, afraid. She remembered him receiving phone calls late at night. She remembered him destroying documents. She remembered him saying, "I was never the person in control." Investigators asked, "Who was?" She answered, "Senator Cross." The case accelerated. Detectives requested old communication records. Most were gone, but one survived. A handwritten call log from Victor Hale's office. The log showed repeated calls between Hale and Cross during the weeks before Daniel's murder, including one call on the night Daniel died. The exact time, 30 minutes before Daniel received a mysterious phone call that brought him to the desert road. The timeline was becoming clear. Daniel received a call. He went to meet someone. Someone already knew where he would be. Someone was waiting. Investigators believe they finally understood the sequence. Victor Hale discovered Daniel's investigation. He informed Richard Cole. Alan Pierce helped control the police response. Thomas Vance carried out the attack. But William Cross was the person who had the power to make everything disappear. The detectives prepared to question Cross. But before they could reach him, something unexpected happened. William Cross contacted them first. He requested a meeting. The senator was now in his late 80s. His health had declined. He arrived using a cane, but his confidence remained. He sat across from investigators, placed his hands on the table, and said, "I know why you're here." The detectives asked, "Do you know Daniel Harper?" Cross looked at the photograph. A long silence followed. Then he answered, "Yes." The investigators asked, "Did you order his death?" Cross smiled slightly. "No." "Then who did?" Cross looked at the detectives and said something nobody expected. Daniel Harper was not killed because he knew too much. A pause. He was killed because he was about to discover who was protecting him. The room became silent. The detectives asked what that meant. Cross refused to explain. Instead, he pushed a document across the table. An old police report. A report from 1982. A report that had never appeared in the official case file. The title shocked investigators. Witness statement. Daniel Harper murder scene. A witness statement from someone who saw the murder. Someone who had been there. Someone who knew the killer. But the witness name was hidden, blackened out. Cross looked at the document, then said, "The person who killed Daniel was never the mystery. The mystery was why nobody wanted the truth about who saw it." The detectives asked, "Who was the witness?" Cross looked at them, then whispered, "The person Daniel trusted most." The answer was impossible, because according to the sealed document, the witness was not a stranger, not a criminal, not a corrupt official. It was someone from Daniel Harper's own family, someone who had spent 40 years pretending not to know what happened, someone whose name had never appeared as a suspect. The witness was Laura Harper, Daniel's wife. The name Laura Harper changed the case once again. For 40 years, Laura had been remembered as the grieving wife, the woman who lost her husband, the woman who waited for answers, the woman who stood beside investigators and begged them to find the person responsible. Her pain became part of the story. Her photographs appeared in newspapers. Her words were repeated in interviews. Someone knows what happened to Daniel. But now investigators had discovered something impossible. Laura Harper was the missing witness, the person who knew more than anyone, the person whose statement had been hidden. The cold case team immediately requested the sealed report. The document had been buried inside archived records. No explanation, no reason, just a file that had disappeared from public access. When investigators opened it, they found Laura's handwritten statement. The date, September 15th, 1982, one day after Daniel's death. The content shocked everyone. Laura had not simply identified a suspect. She had described the entire night. She wrote that Daniel received the phone call around 9:30 p.m. She wrote that he became nervous. She wrote that he took his notebook. But the most important detail came after he left. Laura followed him. She followed him because she knew something was wrong. She watched Daniel drive toward the abandoned mining route, and from a distance, she saw another vehicle arrive, a dark pickup truck, Richard Cole's truck. But then another vehicle appeared, a police vehicle, Detective Alan Pierce's vehicle. Laura watched from far away. She saw 3 men standing near Daniel. Richard Cole, Alan Pierce, and Thomas Vance. She heard shouting. She saw Daniel holding papers. Then she saw Thomas Vance raise a weapon. And Daniel Harper fell. Laura saw everything, but she never told the public. She never told investigators, because the report revealed something else. Laura recognized someone else at the scene, someone she loved, someone she could not believe was involved, someone standing near the vehicles, someone who arrived before the others. Michael Harper, Daniel's younger brother. Laura wrote, Michael knew before anyone else. The investigators were stunned. Michael had claimed he arrived after hearing about the murder, but Laura's statement suggested otherwise. The entire family story changed. The detectives contacted Michael again. This time, they confronted him with Laura's statement. For several minutes, he said nothing. Then he asked, "Is she still alive?" The question was strange. Not, "Why would she say that?" Not, "That is impossible." Only, "Is she still alive?" Investigators realized something. Michael was not surprised. He was afraid. Michael finally admitted that he had lied, but he insisted he did not kill Daniel. He said he arrived at the scene before police because Daniel had called him, not Frank Miller, not Alan Pierce. Michael. Daniel had called his brother first. He wanted help. He wanted someone he trusted. Michael said Daniel told him he had discovered something involving Richard Cole. But when Michael arrived, it was already too late. He saw Daniel arguing with Cole and Pierce. He saw Thomas Vance nearby, but he did not know what to do. He froze. He hid, and he watched his brother die. The detectives asked the obvious question. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Michael looked down. "Because I was threatened." The threat came from Alan Pierce. According to Michael, Pierce found him hiding near the scene. Pierce knew Michael had seen everything. He told him if he spoke, the blame would fall on him. Michael was vulnerable. He already had financial problems. He already had a difficult relationship with Daniel. Pierce knew nobody would believe him, so Michael stayed silent for 40 years. But investigators still needed answers. Why did Laura hide the truth? Why did she protect Michael? Why did she allow her husband's killer to remain free? The answer came from Laura herself. She was now living in a care facility. Her health had declined. When detectives showed her the sealed report, she became emotional. She knew the past had finally returned. She explained that after Daniel's death, she received a visit, not from police, from William Cross, the senator. He came to her home. He knew she had seen everything, and he gave her a choice. Tell the truth and lose everything, or remain silent, and protect what remained of her family. Laura said Cross did not threaten her directly. He did not need to. He knew exactly what to say. He told her Daniel's death was already being controlled. He told her powerful people were involved. He told her she spoke, Michael would be blamed, and he told her something else. Daniel's children would never be safe. Laura believed him, so she buried the truth, not because she wanted justice denied, because she was terrified. The investigators now had the complete picture. Daniel Harper discovered the corruption. Richard Cole benefited from it. Victor Hale managed the records. Alan Pierce controlled the investigation. Thomas Vance carried out the murder. William Cross protected the operation. And Laura Harper became trapped by fear. But one question remained. Who gave the final order? Who decided Daniel Harper had to die? The detectives returned to the original evidence, the recovered photograph, the financial records, the hidden reports. Then they found one final document, a letter written by Thomas Vance, the man accused of pulling the trigger. The letter was discovered inside an old storage unit. It had never been delivered. It was addressed to William Cross. The first line read, "You said nobody would ever know." The second line was even more shocking. But Daniel was not the only problem. Investigators continued reading. Thomas Vance claimed he was hired to scare Daniel, not kill him. The situation changed when someone else arrived. someone who gave a different order, someone who wanted Daniel permanently removed. And according to Vance, that person was not William Cross. It was someone much closer, someone inside Daniel Harper's own family, someone who had spent decades pretending to search for justice. The letter ended with one name, a name that made investigators realize the murder was still not solved. The person who ordered Daniel Harper's death was Michael Harper. The name Michael Harper appeared everywhere, in the witness statement, in Thomas Vance's letter, in the final pages of the investigation. For 40 years, Michael had been considered a victim, the grieving younger brother, the man who lost his family, the man who carried the pain of Daniel's death. But now investigators had to consider the possibility that the person closest to Daniel was the person who wanted him gone. The cold case team knew they had reached the most difficult part of the investigation, not because the evidence was weak, because the truth was complicated. Families protected secrets. People protected each other. And sometimes, the person who caused the tragedy was also someone who suffered from it. Detectives returned to Michael's financial history. They discovered something hidden months before Daniel's murder. Michael had accumulated significant debt, loans, unpaid bills, private payments, and one unusual transaction, a large deposit. The money came from a company connected to Richard Cole, the same companies Daniel had been investigating. The payment date was important. It happened 2 weeks before Daniel died. Michael had claimed he never worked with Cole, but the records suggested otherwise. Investigators confronted him again. This time, there was no sympathy, no assumptions, only evidence. They placed the financial records in front of him. Michael stared at them, then slowly said, "I was desperate." The detectives asked, "Did you sell your brother's information?" Michael shook his head. "No." "Did you help arrange the meeting?" Silence. That silence became the loudest answer. Michael finally admitted something. He had contacted Daniel that night. He was the person who made the phone call, the missing call, the call that brought Daniel to the desert road. For 40 years, investigators believed the killer made that call. But Michael admitted it was him. He claimed he only wanted to talk. He wanted Daniel to stop investigating. He wanted him to walk away before something worse happened. But he said he never intended for Daniel to die. The detectives asked, "Then why was Thomas Vance there?" Michael looked away. "I thought he was there to scare him." That sentence revealed everything. Michael had made a deal. He had given Richard Cole information about Daniel's investigation. He had accepted money. He had arranged a meeting. But he claimed he never agreed to murder. The plan was supposed to be intimidation, a warning, a way to force Daniel to stop. But the situation changed. Thomas Vance arrived. Alan Pierce arrived. And Daniel Harper never came home. The investigators still needed to determine whether Michael was telling the truth. Was he a murderer? Or was he someone who made a terrible decision that allowed one to happen? Then forensic experts found something unexpected. A fingerprint recovered from Daniel's notebook. The notebook that disappeared in 1982. The notebook that contained Daniel's final discoveries. The fingerprint was not Michael's, not Cole's, not Pierce's. It belonged to Thomas Vance. But underneath it was another print, a partial fingerprint, one that had never been identified. The cold case team sent it through updated databases. The result came back within days. The print belonged to Alan Pierce, the former detective, the man who was supposed to protect the investigation. The evidence showed Pierce had handled Daniel's notebook. He had removed it. He had hidden it. But why? The detectives brought Pearson again. This time, they had everything. The notebook, the photograph, the witness statements, the DNA. Pierce looked older, tired. The confidence he once had was gone. They asked him, "Why did you hide Daniel's notebook?" Pierce remained silent. Then he answered, "Because I knew what was inside." The detectives waited. Pierce continued, "Daniel found out the truth about all of us." The statement was shocking. Not some of them. All of us. Pierce admitted he had been involved in the corruption. He admitted helping cover up evidence. But he insisted he did not order Daniel's death. He claimed William Cross controlled everything. He claimed Richard Cole wanted Daniel silenced. He claimed Michael Harper was the one who created the opportunity. Everyone had a piece of the crime, but nobody wanted to admit they owned the whole thing. Then Pierce revealed something investigators never expected. A hidden recording. A recording made the night Daniel died. Pierce said he kept it because he knew one day he might need protection. But voices could be heard. Daniel, Michael, Richard Cole, and another voice. A voice investigators had not heard before. The recording captured a final argument. Daniel saying, "You have no idea what you're involved in." A second voice responding, "You should have stayed out of it." Then a gunshot. The room became silent. The detectives asked, "Who is that voice?" Pierce looked at them, then said, "The person who started everything." The audio was sent for enhancement. Experts worked for weeks. The final analysis identified the voice. It was not Michael Harper, not Richard Cole, not William Cross. It belonged to someone nobody expected, someone who had never appeared in the investigation, someone who had been considered a victim. The voice belonged to Laura Harper, Daniel's wife, the woman who claimed she followed him to save him, the woman who claimed she was threatened into silence, the woman who investigators believed was protecting Michael. But the recording suggested something else. Laura was not just a witness. She was there before anyone else. And she was the last person heard speaking to Daniel before the gunshot. The entire case collapsed into one terrifying possibility. For 40 years, everyone had been searching for the wrong person. The question was no longer, who killed Daniel Harper? It was, did Daniel Harper's own wife set the entire chain of events in motion? The discovery of the recording changed everything. For decades, investigators believed they understood the basic story of Daniel Harper's murder. A mécanique découverte corruption. A powerful group tries to silence him. A conspiracy grows around money and influence. But the recording revealed something far more complicated. The person closest to Daniel may have been connected to the crime from the beginning. Laura Harper, the woman who spent 40 years demanding justice. The woman who appeared on television asking for answers. The woman who told investigators she wanted nothing more than to know who killed her husband. Now her own voice was connected to the final moments of Daniel Harper's life. The cold case team analyzed the audio again and again. They refused to rely on assumptions. They needed certainty. The recording was damaged. The voices were unclear. But one thing was undeniable. Laura was present. The detectives returned to Laura's statement from 1982. The statement where she claimed she followed Daniel after the mysterious phone call. The statement where she described seeing Richard Cole, Alan Pierce, and Thomas Vance. The statement where she claimed she stayed hidden. But investigators discovered a problem. Her timeline did not match the evidence. Laura claimed she arrived after Daniel, but phone records showed something different. Her home received a call before Daniel left. A call that lasted several minutes. A call that had never been explained. Investigators traced the number. It belonged to a private office connected to Victor Hale, the same Victor Hale who controlled property records, the same Victor Hale who worked with Richard Cole, the same Victor Hale who was connected to the corruption Daniel uncovered. The question became unavoidable. Why was Laura Harper communicating with Victor Hale before Daniel's death? When confronted, Laura denied it. At first, then she changed her story. She admitted speaking with Hale, but she claimed it was innocent. She said Hale contacted her because he wanted to warn her. He told her Daniel was in danger. He told her powerful people were involved. He told her she needed to convince Daniel to stop. The detectives asked, "Did you?" Laura remained silent. Then she said, "The answer was not enough. Investigators needed to know what happened next." They searched Laura's financial records and found something hidden, a payment, small compared to the others, but significant, a transfer from an account connected to Victor Hale. The payment arrived 3 days after Daniel's murder. Laura claimed it was a loan. Investigators believed it was something else, a reward, or a payment for silence. But then another discovery changed the case again. A second notebook. Not Daniel's, Laura's. Hidden inside a box in her home. The notebook contained years of private thoughts, fear, regret, confusion, and one entry dated September 14, 1982, the night Daniel died. The entry read, "I know what they're planning. I know what will happen if Daniel continues. I have to choose." Investigators continued reading. The next sentence was the one that shocked them. "I called Victor because I needed a way out. Not because she wanted Daniel dead. Not because she wanted money. Because she was afraid." The investigators began to understand. Laura was not the mastermind. She was trapped. But the question remained. What did she choose? The answer came from the final pages. Laura wrote that Daniel discovered the truth about the land operation. He discovered Richard Cole, Victor Hale, William Cross. But Daniel also discovered something about his own family, something involving Michael. Laura admitted that Michael had been taking money from Cole. She knew. She confronted him. She told him to stop. But Michael became desperate. He believed Daniel would destroy him. He believed he had no future if Daniel exposed everything. According to Laura's journal, Michael was a person who called Daniel, but he was not supposed to kill him. He wanted a confrontation, a warning, a final attempt to make Daniel stop. Laura believed she could prevent disaster, so she followed. But when she arrived, the situation had already changed. Thomas Vance had a weapon. Alan Pierce was protecting the operation. Richard Cole was demanding Daniel surrender the evidence. And Michael realized he had lost control. The gunshot ended everything. Laura's greatest mistake was not murder. It was silence. She believed protecting Michael would protect the family. Instead, she protected the people who destroyed it. The investigators now had the full chain. Michael Harper started the meeting. Richard Cole organized the pressure. Victor Hale managed the corruption. Alan Pierce controlled the cover-up. Thomas Vance carried out the attack. William Cross protected the entire network. And Laura Harper hid the truth. The case was no longer about finding a killer. It was about exposing every person who allowed Daniel Harper's death to remain unsolved. But one question remained. Who actually fired the weapon? The DNA evidence pointed to Thomas Vance. The recording suggested his involvement, but investigators still needed confirmation. They searched Thomas Vance's old records and discovered something unexpected. Before disappearing from Arizona, Vance left behind a personal journal. The journal was found in a storage facility under another name. Inside was confession, not a complete one, but enough. Vance wrote, "I was hired to scare him. I was told nobody would get hurt." Then Pierce changed the plan. The detectives froze because the journal suggested the murder happened because someone changed the instructions. Someone escalated the situation. Someone decided Daniel Harper could never leave alive. And that person was not Michael, not Cole, not Hale. It was Alan Pierce, the detective who was supposed to solve the murder, the detective who controlled the evidence, the detective who protected everyone else, the person who had been closest to the truth from the beginning. The investigation team prepared the final arrest, but before they could move, they received one final message. A handwritten letter delivered anonymously. Inside was a single sentence. "You found the people who pulled the strings, but you still haven't found who created the game." At the bottom of the page was one signature, a name investigators thought had disappeared forever. William Cross. The senator was still alive, still watching, and he was ready to reveal the final secret behind Daniel Harper's murder. The final letter from William Cross arrived like a warning, not an apology, not a confession, a message, a reminder that even after 40 years, the people involved in Daniel Harper's murder still had secrets left to reveal. The investigators had spent months rebuilding the timeline. They uncovered the corruption, They identified the people involved. They exposed a cover-up. But William Cross was right about one thing. They still did not understand the beginning. They knew who handled the records. They knew who hid the evidence. They knew who pulled the trigger. But they did not know who created the entire operation, who decided that people could be controlled through fear and money, who built the network that eventually destroyed Daniel Harper. The cold case team arranged one final interview with William Cross. The former senator agreed, but this time he did not arrive as a suspect. He arrived as someone who wanted the truth known. He entered the room slowly, older, weaker, but calm. The detectives placed Daniel Harper's photograph on the table. Cross looked at it for a long time. Then he said, Daniel was the only person who understood what was happening. The detectives asked, Then why did you let him die? Cross looked down, and for the first time, he appeared tired. Not afraid, not angry. He explained that the operation did not begin with crime. It began with opportunity. Years earlier, powerful businessmen and officials discovered that controlling land meant controlling communities, small towns, poor areas, places where people had little power. The system grew slowly. A property transfer here, a business agreement there, a favor between people who believed they were untouchable. Nobody thought it would become what it became, until people started disappearing, until witnesses became silent, until Daniel Harper started asking questions. Cross admitted he knew about Daniel's investigation. He admitted he ordered people to watch him, but he denied ordering his murder. The detectives asked, Then who did? Cross looked at them and answered, Alan Pierce. The name was already known, but the reason shocked investigators. According to Cross, Pierce was not simply protecting the operation. He was protecting himself. Pierce had discovered that Daniel was investigating more than land fraud. Daniel had found evidence connecting Pierce to another crime, a crime from years earlier, a crime that could destroy his career and send him to prison. Daniel had found proof that Pierce had previously altered evidence in another investigation. He was afraid Daniel would expose him. So Pierce made a decision. He turned Daniel's investigation into a murder. The detectives returned to Pierce's records. They found the final missing piece, a payment made to Thomas Vance, not from Richard Cole, not from Victor Hale, from an account controlled by Alan Pierce. The evidence was now complete. Pierce hired Vance. Pierce manipulated the investigation. Pierce removed Daniel's notebook. Pierce protected every person involved. And Pierce created the illusion that the murder was unsolvable. But there was one final question. Why did Pierce allow the case to reopen 40 years later? The answer came from Frank Miller, the retired officer who started everything. Miller revealed that Pierce contacted him shortly before his death. He wanted to confess, but he was too afraid. Pierce knew the truth was coming out. He knew technology would eventually uncover the evidence. DNA, digital records, old documents. He knew time was no longer protecting him. The case was finally moving toward its conclusion. Arrests followed. Richard Cole was charged with conspiracy and corruption-related crimes. Victor Hale's records exposed decades of illegal activity. Several officials connected to the operation faced investigations. Thomas Vance was already deceased, but his confession became a crucial part of the case. Alan Pierce became the central figure, the man who was supposed to find the killer, the man who had spent decades hiding him, the man who believed the desert would erase everything. But the most emotional moment came when Daniel Harper's family finally received the full truth. For 40 years, they carried questions. Why Daniel? Why that night? Why nobody could solve it? Now they had answers, painful answers. But answers. Daniel's daughter, who was only a child when he died, spoke publicly after the investigation concluded. She said, I always wondered if my father was forgotten. He wasn't. He was waiting for someone to listen. The abandoned desert road, where Daniel Harper was found, became a symbol, not of a perfect investigation, but of persistence, a reminder that some cases are not lost. They are simply waiting. waiting for someone to look again, waiting for someone to question the old answers, waiting for one forgotten detail to change everything. The Arizona 1982 cold case had finally been cracked. A retired officer's memory reopened the door. A hidden photograph exposed the lies. A forgotten notebook revealed the motive, and DNA connected the final pieces. But the story of Daniel Harper remained more than a murder investigation. It became a warning. Because the most dangerous secrets are not always hidden in dark places. Sometimes they are hidden inside official reports, inside respected names, inside people trusted to protect the truth. For 40 years, the desert held on to Daniel Harper's final night. The wind covered the roads. The dust covered the evidence. The years covered the memories. But the truth survived, and when the final clue finally surfaced, the silence ended. The case that everyone believed would remain unsolved was finally answered. Daniel Harper's name was cleared. His story was heard. No secret stays buried forever. Months after the arrests, the desert outside the small Arizona town looked exactly the same. The same empty roads, the same dry wind, the same endless horizon stretching beyond the mountains. To anyone passing by, it was just another forgotten piece of land. But investigators knew better. They knew that beneath those silent roads was a story that had almost disappeared. A story about a man who found something he was never supposed to find. Daniel Harper's name was no longer written inside an abandoned case file. It was no longer just a photograph sitting inside a dusty evidence box. It became a reminder that one person asking the right questions can threaten an entire system. The final investigative report contained hundreds of pages, names, documents, financial records, witness statements, every piece of evidence that had been hidden, ignored, or forgotten. But the most important page was not about the suspects. It was about Daniel himself. Investigators wrote, Daniel Harper was not targeted because he was powerful. He was targeted because he refused to look away. That sentence became the final conclusion of the case. Because Daniel was never a detective, never a politician, never someone with authority. He was simply a mechanic who noticed something wrong. A missing document, a suspicious transaction, a question nobody wanted answered. And instead of ignoring it, he followed it. That decision cost him his life. But it also became the reason the truth survived. The investigation also changed how the community viewed the people involved. For decades, many believed the case failed because there was not enough evidence. But the truth was different. The evidence existed. It was always there. It was buried beneath decisions made by people who had the power to control what others saw. The missing notebook, the forgotten witness statement, the altered reports, the hidden payments. None of it disappeared by accident. It disappeared because someone wanted it gone, and that realization affected everyone who worked on the case. Detective Rachel Morgan, the lead investigator on the reopened investigation, later described the case as one of the most difficult of her career, not because of the crime scene, not because of the evidence, but because of the human element. She said the hardest part was accepting that so many people knew pieces of the truth, and so many chose silence. Frank Miller carried that guilt for 4 decades. The retired officer who finally reopened the case spent his final years speaking about Daniel Harper. He admitted that staying silent was the biggest mistake of his life. But he also believed one thing. A mistake does not have to become the end of the story. Sometimes a person can spend years trying to correct the one moment they failed. The final interview with Miller was recorded shortly before his death. When asked what he wanted people to remember about Daniel, he did not talk about the murder. He did not talk about the suspects. He simply said, "Remember that he cared enough to ask questions." That became the final message connected to the case. Not revenge, not anger, accountability. The abandoned mining road where Daniel was found eventually became part of a memorial trail. A small marker was placed there. No dramatic monument, no large ceremony, just a simple message. Truth survives those who try to bury it. Years later, investigators still received occasional messages from people connected to the original investigation, former employees, old witnesses, people who had remained silent because they were afraid. Some provided new information. Some apologized. Some simply wanted to say they were sorry they waited so long. The cold case had created a final unexpected result. It encouraged others to speak. Other forgotten cases were reopened. Other families received answers. Because Daniel Harper's story proved something important. A case does not become impossible because time passes. It becomes impossible when people stop searching. And, in the end, the biggest mystery was not who killed Daniel Harper. The biggest mystery was how many people knew the truth and convinced themselves silence was easier. For 40 years, the desert kept the secret. For 40 years, powerful names survived. For 40 years, a family waited. But then one retired officer opened an old notebook. One investigator asked a new question. One piece of forgotten evidence returned. And everything changed. The Arizona 1982 cold case that once seemed destined to remain unsolved finally reached its conclusion. Not because the past changed. Because someone finally had the courage to look at it again. And somewhere beyond the desert roads, beyond the abandoned mines, beyond the years of silence, Daniel Harper's final question was finally answered. The truth was no longer hidden. The evidence was no longer buried. And the case that haunted Arizona for 4 decades was finally closed.